Progressive overload. What is it? What is not? What is it not? Progressive overload. You can incur this. You can run into this in many ways. You can do this by adding more weight. However, you're not going to be able to progress this forever. There's a reason that the strongest people that are in our world, they aren't just linearly getting stronger. There are handicaps to this, ceilings to this, if you will. So progressing weight is something that a lot of people can do, but there will be a point where even though you're doing everything right, like just muscularly, like you're not able to translate that over to pushing more strength. Now, a lot of people think that they've hit this before they actually have. And typically there's more so an issue with stability. But that's a separate topic in itself. Another way that you can progressively overload: more reps. Specific rep range is based on the goal and the requirements of the exercises versus the skill and the deficits of the individual. So for example, something like a squat or an RDL, a bilateral RDL. I'm not going to have someone, or I'm not going to have myself, I'm not going to work 15 to 25 reps, even though this is like a big bang for your buck in terms of glute recruitment, glute work, because I will likely hit technical failure before I hit muscular failure, meaning I'll probably hit a point where either my upper back is not able to continue to stabilize, I guess you could say that, yeah, or my upper back musculature is just not strong enough to hold the dumbbell. But largely it's going to be my pelvic stability, like my rib cage to my core. I'm not going to be able to withstand that. Now, the idea being that you establish the rep range that is appropriate for the technical requirements of the movement. So a leg press, an abduction machine, a leg extension, these are ones that, yes, like you could fuck them up, but realistically they don't have a high technical need. Whereas a squat pattern, an RDL, an overhead press, like these require skill. So from a loading perspective, I want someone to get the most out of this movement without putting them in a position where we're now challenging them technically past what they can handle, because ultimately that's not going to return aligned in a way with our goal of, in my case, hypertrophy. With the squat, my lower back is going to fatigue. I mean, like if I'm lifting for hypertrophy, yeah, like the pendulum squat, shit, like 9 to 12, like by 10, 11, 12, like my lower back, like I might feel the musculature working, but I also feel my core working. I also feel my quads working. Like overall, like it's a very loadable movement. And because I'm getting that same because I'm getting so much exposure to my glutes throughout my training week, they're probably not going to hit muscular failure nearly as soon as these other muscle groups that are not as readily trained. Something that takes much less skill in terms of technique. Like I should be mindful of my core positioning on a leg press, but I don't have the same stability needs. And because of that, that's something that, yes, I can progressive load, but there's only a certain point before there's not nearly as good, as great of a return there. And really, I would say past the point of like 15 reps. And for leg press, like I don't really go past 15 unless there's like a very clear cut intention behind that. But for something like abduction, for something like a kickback, it's a little more reasonable considering the fact the technical needs are not as great and the loading ability of these muscles is also not as great. So then we can compensate with a higher rep range, a higher degree of exposure. Now, the other way that we can progressively overload is more sets, which I don't recommend because I think a lot of people will find themselves caught into a volume trap. And more volume in a workout eventually leads to lower effort across all movements. So having really the awareness around, okay, these primary movements, these ones programmed at the very, like put into the very beginning of my workout, the intention is to test my skill and to make progress here. And then I have movements at the end of my workout that, yes, I want to grow glutes, so I'm going to put in abduction machine, I'm going to put in a cable kickback. But the idea is like, yes, I will still continue to progress, but they don't have the same technical requirements as, let's say, these big movers. But with those big movers, if let's say I were to start adding in 4 sets, 5 sets, it's going to be very difficult to withstand and use the same load I'm using at, let's say, working set 1 as I would be able to working set 5. And like, frankly, if you're needing 4 or 5 sets, let's say 10 to 12 reps, you're probably not getting nearly the progression that you could if you were to scale it back to 3 sets, have a really good tempo, make sure that you are doing everything in order to drive that strength progression week to week, bi-weekly, monthly. Another way that you can progressively overload, more time under tension. So in the case that, like, let's say you're trying to uphold a certain standard, a certain volume in your training, but you're not able to do so with load, you go down and you spend more time exposed to the set. Longer, more seconds. That's it. Now, people will ask me, like, can't I progressively overload by reducing the rest time in between my working sets or in between unilateral movements or in between exercises? Sure, but I think that can be a slippery slope, and then that can lead you to not being fully recovered, making it to where if there's a drop off in progression, like in the loadability of, let's say, the next movement you go into, well, is that true, or is that only because, like, is that accurate, I guess I should say, or is that only because you took less time in that rest period in between? I think globally, like, it needs to be done carefully if you're going to reduce rest periods. So another way that you can progressively overload is improving the quality. Now, I'll tell you, when I started working with Jordan, we were doing the B-Stance RDL. And I think before we were dating, I'd sent him a video of me doing B-Stance RDL, even though predominantly I was doing bilateral. He recommended it. And I was like doing maybe 35, 40 pounds. Form was garbage, lots of compensation. Like, it was fine, but it was like, looking back, I'm like, there are clear things that, like, I was doing to compensate in order to lift that weight. When we started working together, one of the biggest things that stood out to him was my lack of hip stability. And this queued up and essentially informed us that I need to do a lot of unilateral movements. I need to do movements that require a lot of internal rotation into the working leg. And the more that I've gotten better at that, I've been able to get more out of seemingly the same weight session to session, because I've been focusing on that stability component. Because for me, how that manifests, like, let's say in a split squat, is there's that tendency to begin to shake, like horizontally, laterally. There's that tendency to want to bring the big toe off the ground, or to want to change thoracic spine orientation. Now, what we were able to see is that in the case where I was very unstable early on into working together, one of the things that he recommended is not necessarily going up in weight, because that would challenge me in a different way, but to spend more time exposed to said weight with that intention around positioning. Yes, time under tension, but also time under tension without the cueing of correct positioning. It's just more time spent doing it wrong. Now, hip stability, yes, was an issue, but pelvic stability was a large issue. And that was one that once I had a warm-up designed to encourage adequate pelvic stability and cueing of that core bracing while I was doing these movements, it made it to where I developed a mind-muscle connection to that position, like the actual contraction of my core being in the right position, in, I guess, really a reference point of knowing, like, okay, this is what this will feel like. And if I start to experience this sensation, then I know that I'm not stabilizing correctly at the core. So in between my warm-up sets, I need to probably go back to the floor, do some 90-90s, work on some movements that essentially help me maintain that position when then under load. Progressing quality is largely unexploited. And it's something I think when we're talking about stability specifically, that's an area that a lot of us can benefit from. Now, what is not progressive overload? Doing the same sets, the same reps, the same movements, the same weight, and the same quality every single week, and not changing anything. Not getting stronger, just doing the reps to completion. Maybe they're a little less hard, but you've now made that adaptation, and like, you're just still, you go in, you do the leg extension, you're like, yep, 50 pounds, 3 sets of 12, cool, I'm good. Not being intentional with trying to get stronger, not being intentional with trying to develop a skill, not being intentional with trying to spend more time under tension. Things that ultimately make it to where it's hard to assess whether or not you actively or adequately progressively overload is changing your movement patterns constantly. Not recovering in between sessions. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe that's like, hey, like I have it on my plan that I'm doing glutes and hams, then quads and hams, then glutes. And like, if you have a split like that, if the split is just designed poorly and doesn't allow for adequate recovery, that's an issue. Maybe it's unintentional. Maybe you slept like shit. But having a very clear idea as to why you're not able to get stronger or why you're not able to progress within a rep range, that can be very telling.